All right, good afternoon, everybody. Jim Schwartz here with Beck's Hybrids. We're going to kick this webinar off. The reason we're hosting this webinar today is, we've had a lot of warm weather, and the wheat really started to green up and take off. And obviously the forecast for tonight and tomorrow night is calling for temperatures in the low to mid-teens. So we thought it'd be a great idea to get one of our wheat specialists, Austin Scott, to come join us for 20 to 30 minutes today to tell us a little bit about how do we stage our wheat, what's the potential damage that comes from these cold temperatures, what do I look for when I walk those fields, and then what happens if I have another cold snap like this in a couple weeks. So we're very pleased to have Austin Scott join us. We're going to turn this webinar over to him. During the course of this webinar, if you do have questions, there's a blue Q&A box in the upper right. You click that, and then a text box will appear in the lower right of your screen. Feel free to type in your question. Then as we go through the webinar, I may interject and ask Austin the question, or we may wait till the end of the webinar. With that, Austin, we're going to unmute you, turn it over to you, and allow you to share with the group a little bit about what we can expect over the next couple of days with our wheat crop.
Thanks, Jim. Hopefully everybody can hear me pretty good. Like Jim said, we've got some cold weather rolling in, and we just wanted to get some information, some timely information out to everybody on how to properly assess and scout for this damage that could be potentially coming. So like Jim said, I'm Austin Scott. I'm the agronomist down in Kentucky, Tennessee. So I cover this southern area for Beck's, and I've got quite a bit of wheat in my territory. So this has been a major concern for us over the past week. I've received several phone calls on it. So as we get into this presentation, there's a few things that I'm going to try to hit throughout it, just to try to cover the entire topic. So we're going to start out with some key numbers that you really need to know just to achieve those good yields in wheat. Then kind of the proper way to estimate yield potential, early in the year and potentially after you've received some freeze damage. So one of the main things that you really need to know, though, is how to properly stage the wheat crop. So there's different stages that we're going to discuss here that really influence how much cold temperatures you can actually take. Really closely together. So Feekes 5 to Feekes 6. There's a 12-degree temperature swing there. So it's really important to know what growth stage your crop is actually at. Then we're going to get into how cold it really needs to be to do damage, whether it's severe damage or just moderate damage. Then we're going to assess the freeze damage, kind of by stage to see how it's going to affect the yield, and then just wrap everything up. So hopefully we won't keep you on here too long. It's going to be about maybe a 20-minute talk here. Like Jim said, there's that Q&A section in your screen there to ask questions. If you have them going along, feel free to ask those, and then we'll pull some of those questions back in at the end of the talk. So to start with, first thing in the year when we're assessing that stand of wheat, what really are we looking for? Some of the key numbers here. And let me preface this real quick. A lot of this data comes from Chad Lee at the University of Kentucky. The University of Kentucky is very big in my territory for their wheat publications. They've got a lot of really good information, so I'll be referencing them quite a bit throughout this talk. But right there at emergence, we're looking at about 25 to 30 plants per square foot. So I keep a 12-inch by 12-inch metal square in my truck to go out and take a lot of these counts with. I would suggest painting it red, or else you will lose it in that wheat field pretty easily. But you just take it out, throw it, and count the plants as they're starting to come up inside that square foot. You do that several times throughout the field. You can kind of get a feel for a good, accurate stand count. Tillers and taking tiller counts is very important also. You do it in the fall and in the spring. So you really want 70 to 100 tillers. I'm not scared of 120 tillers. It's when you get upwards of 140 or so is where you kind of want to back off a little bit, or if you're below 70, it really influences, or I guess it gives you a good idea of when you need to get out there with your nitrogen in the early spring. So if you're below that 70 mark, you might want to get out pretty early in the spring with a shot of nitrogen to influence some early spring tiller growth. But if you're, like I said, upwards of 130, 140, well, you might want to delay that nitrogen shot in the spring just a little bit because you don't really need any more tillers. Then we've got some heading, some head counts down there below it. So it's really important to take those stand counts because you can assess your yield potential from them. So as you can see right here, it's a really good table that we've got, and I want you to kind of take a mental image here, some of those 100% yield potentials all the way down, because we're going to use this table again a little bit later to assess damaged crop and see what our yield potential is still going to be after we get some freeze damage on it. So above 24, 25 plants per square foot, you're at that 100% yield mark. It's when you start dropping below it is where you actually start seeing some detrimental yield potential there. So you get down to that very bottom one on a 20% stand, you're looking at 6 to 7 plants per square foot. You're below half your yield potential at that point. You know, wheat has the ability to tiller and compensate for a lot of area and make up some yield, but it's greatly limited at the same time. Not quite as good as soybeans in that aspect. Like I said, keep this chart in mind for later reference though. So staging that crop, I like the Feekes Scale. There is another method called the Feekes Scale. It ranges from 0 to 99, but the Feekes Scale is that 1 to 11 from emergence all the way through ripening. I think it's a little bit easier for understanding as far as compared to the Feekes Scale. I've got some red boxes around Feekes 3 and Feekes 6 right now because that's where the majority of our wheat is kind of in between that Feekes 3 to Feekes 6 stage. You know, as you move south, some of the wheat has actually got to that Feekes 7, Feekes 8 stage, but most of it's still in that 5 to 6 range. So what is that though? So obviously Feekes 1 is just one shoot. So you've got emergence, you've got your shoot up out of the ground. Jumping to Feekes 3, that's when you start forming those tillers. So tillers are just extra stems coming off the base of that plant, adding extra stems to that plant. And then jumping up to Feekes 6. Feekes 6 is that joining stage. A lot of folks call it joint. That's when your growing point actually moves above ground. So from Feekes 5 to Feekes 6, you've got about a 12-degree temperature swing in temperatures that you can actually tolerate. And we'll get into that just a little bit deeper here in just a second. But just remember, at Feekes 5, your growing point is still at ground level or below ground level, so it's still protected and insulated pretty good. Feekes 6, it moves up into the plant above ground, and it becomes a lot more vulnerable to the environment. So from that point forward, that growing point is steadily going to raise through that plant. So I pulled this chart from the National Weather Service earlier this week, and it indicates the temperatures that we're going to see, sort of. So the areas in blue are going to experience below normal temperatures for this time of the year, but it seems that Tuesday night into Wednesday night, so tonight is going to be the coldest of that Arctic air pushing down. So I've got some stars listed there. There's 5 stars representing 5 different PFR locations. I left the Southern Illinois PFR location off. And Jonathan Perkins, if you're on here, I apologize for that. But we've got a good representation of the area based on these stars right now. So I just pulled some of the low temperatures that we can expect. So in Atlanta, Indiana, I think they're going to get down to about 13 to 14 degrees tonight. Downs, Illinois, they're predicted to get down into about that 9 to 11 degree temperature range right there for lows. London, Ohio is expecting to get down to about 13 degrees. Henderson, Kentucky, which is where I'm at right now, is expecting to drop down to about 20 degrees tonight. And then Colfax, Iowa is going to be the coldest at about 7 degrees. So, I mean, you can see that we've got some unseasonably cool temperatures pretty much blanketing our entire marketing area, especially the big wheat growing areas down south where I'm at. You can see it's pretty well covered up with those blue boxes. So this is a good publication from the University of Kentucky that explains what temperature or at what temperatures actually cause a yield loss. So remember I was saying that a lot of our wheat is at this tillering stage right now. Some of the late planted wheat is actually tillering. So it can withstand 12 degrees for 2 hours. So I've got another graph that we'll show here in just a minute that's a lot more fluid. These numbers aren't set in stone. So between tillering and jointing, I know there's a lot of play there. There's several other growth stages in between there, but it gives you a good perspective of when you can start to see yield loss. So if your wheat's tillering right now, it's at that Feekes 3 stage, and you get to 12 degrees for many hours, for at least 2 hours or longer. Then you go on over there, you got some symptoms you can see, but your yield loss is going to be in that slight to moderate category. But remember, a lot of our wheat, especially down south, the further south you move, is at this joint stage. So you move on over there, it jumps to 24 degrees is when you start seeing injury. So again, just knowing the difference between Feekes 5 and Feekes 6, when that growing point moves above ground, is gonna really affect whether that temperature hurts it bad enough or not. So you move on across and you get sustained temperatures of 24 degrees or below for more than 2 hours. You get to that yield effect over there. You're looking at a moderate to severe yield loss. So this is when we actually start seeing quite a bit of damage, is when you start dropping below 24 degrees for more than 2 hours at joint or after. So like I said, that's pretty cut and dry on that chart. This chart was adapted from a Kansas State publication, and it's a lot more fluid. So if you can see, and I'm going to see if I can, hopefully I can see my pointer on here. So we've got this joining stage right here. So the blue graph represents 2 hours, because that's when you start seeing yield damage. So we've got this starting to joint stage right there, running at injury. If you go across there, it's about 19 degrees where you start to see injury if you're starting to joint. So that's when that growing point is pulling above ground. Well, if you go on up, I think I lost my pointer there. But if you go on up and look at that after you've actually already jointed, well, then you're in that 28 to 29 degree range where you're seeing damage. So if you're starting to joint, you can withstand a lot more cold temperatures as compared to if you've already jointed or been jointed for 7 to 10 days. I mean, you're looking at a 8 degree temperature swing right there that could potentially damage your yield quite a bit. Then you get on out. So what happens if you catch another frost in 3 weeks from now when that head's in the boot and it's sitting there very vulnerable? Well, as long as it doesn't get below about 29 or 30 degrees, you should be okay. I've got some pictures in a little while that shows you what happens if you do get sub-freezing temperatures. But wheat's pretty hardy. It can withstand that 30 degree mark pretty good. And remember that head is the most vulnerable thing. That's what you want to protect the entire time. So as we start to see some of this freeze damage, you may have seen some of this already with some light frost that we've had, is just leaf burn. So leaf tip necrosis is quite common in several varieties. It does differ by variety though. So some wheat varieties are more susceptible to leaf burn than others are, and it looks really similar to nitrogen applications actually. But when that frost hits, what happens is it actually burns and kills those cells, and the tips of that wheat will actually become necrotic or burned. I mean, like I said, it looks a lot like nitrogen damage. This is something that I would expect to see quite a bit from this freeze event. Whether we have yield damage or not, I really would expect to see quite a bit of foliar damage. A lot of times this is not really yield limiting. It's more aesthetics, and it kind of scares you quite a bit when you start to see it. But it doesn't really limit yield. That plant will send out more tillers. It'll create a lot more vegetation there to take up some of the difference for photosynthesizing. So I would expect to see that quite a bit. Now here's something that I'd also expect to see, that if you see it doesn't necessarily mean that the head is dead. But take a look at the picture on the right hand of your screen here. You can see where that plant turns from brown to green. That's your growing point. So that's the head of that wheat. This wheat's jointed. Several of them are already have a second joint on them, but that lower joint beneath it, that stem is kind of hollow, and it'll actually freeze out, and it will start to collapse. So that stem can actually collapse down on itself and start to split. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see yield damage from it. Now, if you get a head that emerges, your head hadn't been damaged, and it emerges later in the year, you can see some lodging. And I've seen that quite a bit in the past. Is when that wheat goes to head out, you catch a wind event or a rain event, and the plants start breaking down there at that stem, and they actually lay down on the ground. Now you still have your grain to harvest, but it's just a lot harder to get up, and you'll start decreasing the yield because of those plants just laying on the ground. But just because you see that stem brown down there at the bottom does not necessarily mean that plant is dead. So this is a really good way to determine yield loss. So after a hard freeze, you want to wait about, I've got 3 to 5 days on there. I'd say at the minimum of 5 to 7 days. Wait about a week to go out there after your temperatures have warmed back up, above 45, 50 degrees, get that wheat growing good again. But you go out there and assess the wheat damage then. So what you want to do is you want to locate the growing point on that plant. And you take and split the stem lengthwise. You can do it with a really sharp knife, but I would recommend going and getting a utility knife. So I use a razor blade to do it whenever I split the stems, because you can easily damage that wheat head and then be out there all day just splitting stems trying to get a good wheat head to look at to assess the damage. So right here on the left, we've got a healthy growing point. So that's a healthy wheat head, immature wheat head that we're looking at right there. It's kind of a whitish green appearance, but it's really crisp, and it's got a lot of pressure in it. It's called turgor pressure. So then we've got a damaged wheat head on the right. So it's kind of tough to see that it's damaged. But you can see that it's a lot limper, so it's lost its turgor pressure. So turgor pressure is something that all plants have. What it is the water inside that cell keeps it rigid, so it keeps that cell pumped up quite a bit. So what happens to water when it freezes up? When water freezes, it expands, right? So if those cells are full of water, they're tight from that turgor pressure, and then they freeze. Well, it bursts the cells. So you'll get this on the right, this limp looking head that's lost all of its turgor pressure. All right. So after it's damaged, about a week after the freeze event has occurred, you go out there, you split the stem, and you excavate that head out. And usually a hand lens is necessary. I've got pretty good vision. But I still carry a little magnifying glass or a hand lens with me to assess these immature heads. So after it dies, though, it's going to kind of turn it'll be greenish color for the first couple of days, but then, like I said, about a week after, it's going to start to turn white and then brown, and it's going to appear water-soaked, and it's going to look like it's starting to rot away some. Well, like I said, a hand lens is really really beneficial in this situation when you're excavating these small heads there. It takes a really fine hand, and you'll probably destroy the first 5 or 10 that you try to excavate before you finally get the hang of it to start to pull these smaller wheat heads out. So mature heads, so what happens if we catch a freeze a little bit later in the year? So these heads can be completely killed or they can be partially killed. You see the picture right there on the left hand of your screen, only half of that head was killed off, but the ones on the right were completely bleached. So that's what they'll look like when they actually emerge from that plant. They'll have that kind of a bleached, dead look to them. That's usually what happens a little bit later in the year. If you catch a freeze late, that's kind of what they look like. All right, guys, just to wrap up here, I want to get y'all back out on the road, get you back to your fields and preparing for this cold weather that's fixing to hit. But we're going to wrap up here real quick. So it's important to know the crop that you're dealing with, to know the yield potential that you had going into this event. So knowing you're taking your stand counts early in the year, it's important to know those things. But then it's also important to know the growth stage that your wheat is in right now. Because like I said, between Feekes 5 and Feekes 6, there's a 12-degree temperature swing that wheat can or can't tolerate. So remember that wheat that's already jointed, when that growing point moves above ground, remember, that 24-degree mark is kind of your the area that you want to be above. So above 24 degrees, you should be okay unless you've been jointed for several weeks. Then you want to be upwards of that 26 to 28 degree mark. But anything below 24 degrees for more than 2 hours is more than likely going to cause some severe to moderate yield damage. Prior to joint, it's kind of the same thing, except you get lower, you got more wiggle room. You've got a lower temperature that you can deal with there. So 12 degrees is, for more than 2 hours, is your mark that you're looking at. So, at Henderson, like I said, 20 degrees here tonight. Any wheat that's jointed, any late planted wheat should be okay. But, if you're in Downs, Illinois, and you've got jointed wheat and you're supposed to get to 10 degrees tonight, if it sustains that 10 degrees for more than 2 hours, then you're also looking at some damage. The second point I've got there, leaf burn does not automatically mean yield loss. Like I said, there's several differences in genetics. Some genetics will show leaf tip necrosis more than others, but it doesn't always translate into yield loss. I will say that I expect to see quite a bit of leaf burn from this event, so it's important to go out there and actually look at excavate those immature wheat heads before you decide to completely tear up the field. To go a little bit deeper in your assessment, you want to wait about a week after the temperatures have warmed back up before you go to assess that potential yield loss. And like I said, warm back up, what does that mean? We want that wheat to be actively growing again, so upwards of that 45, 50 degree mark. You should be able to get a good representation of that wheat at that point. So I realize that we're going to be cold for a few more days here, and then you wait another week after that. Well, that's putting us at the end of March before we can even get out there and properly assess the damage that we've got. But, Mother Nature isn't always kind, and she doesn't always come at the right time. So it's just one of the things that we've got to assess. I've got several producers that are waiting to put on their next shot of nitrogen or their herbicide application of Harmony until we can figure out what's going on in these fields. But like I said, to assess that damage, you want to split the stem vertically with some sort of razor blade or utility knife. And excavate that immature head out. The healthy head should be light green, glossy, and turgid. So remember that means really stiff. It shouldn't be limp. The damaged head will be pale white to tan and limp. So it's lost its rigidity. So it's going limp in there. So, and then that last point, just if few heads are damaged, then you can expect slight to moderate yield losses. If I were you, I would take and kind of prioritize my fields to high risk fields, medium risk to low risk, and I'd do that based on planting date. So you know when the fields were planted, and if it was late planted wheat, you know, if you're November planted wheat or the end of October planted wheat, then that field's probably got less of a risk, you know, unless you're in Colfax, Iowa, and you're getting 7 degrees. Well, I think it's all high risk at that point. But that early planted wheat is the stuff that's going to be at the highest risk. You know, down here in my territory, I think if there is a saving grace, I think our saving grace is going to be the fact that we were extremely dry at planting time. So I had some producers go 40, 45 days without any moisture right at planting time, and it held that wheat crop back quite a bit. So it got off to a slow start, but then again, we had a really mild winter, so we had a lot of winter growth on this crop. So we're still ahead as far as growth goes on our winter wheat crop this year than we are compared to other years. But I think if we'd have caught a rain in October, then it would have been a lot worse. There would have been a lot more potential for damage at this time. A few other key points that I'll throw out here. If you are still in that joint stage and your growing point is still below ground or at the ground level, you know, saturated conditions would do you good because it would freeze up and it would kind of buffer you a little bit. That ground temperature would be, you know, that 30 to 32 degree mark, just frozen, but it wouldn't necessarily be down at that 12 degree mark, even though air temperatures may be. It would be protecting and insulating it a little bit. If you've got any snow on the ground, I'd say that's going to insulate it a little bit as well. Also, if you've got a real healthy stand, you've got a lot of lush vegetation right there, it'll buffer the temperatures as well to that growing point. But if your wheat's already jointed, your growing point is several inches above the ground, well, I think you're going to be at quite a bit of risk there. So it's a lot of information in a short period of time. I know there was things I didn't cover and things that you probably want some clarification on. So at this time, I'm going to open the floor for any questions that y'all might have.
Austin, great job. Really appreciate the thoroughness. A couple things. If folks do have questions, feel free to reach out to your local Beck's seed advisor or your Beck's field agronomist. They'll be happy to answer questions or direct you to the right person. And Austin, of course, will be available as well. Austin, I have a question that's popped in here. If I do have light or moderate damage and say I see that necrosis on the tip, does that change my behavior? Does it change how I apply my nitrogen or my herbicides? Does it alter any of those practices if I have light to moderate injury?
So, Jim, that's an excellent question, and it's a question that a lot of producers are going to be asking themselves, I'd say, within the next 10 to 14 days. And at that point, I would say if you do have severe necrosis of the leaf, severe leaf death, I think a little bit of nitrogen would help that out a little bit to promote more vegetative growth. And then the same thing with the herbicide application. You never really want to, even though the crop is tolerant to a lot of the herbicides, you don't want to stress it out any more than it is. So as far as the herbicide point of view, I would wait for the temperatures to warm back up just a little bit. Give that plant a few days to get through the challenges that it's had before you make that herbicide application.
All right, I don't see any more questions. Austin, again, fantastic job. Really appreciate your thoroughness. Folks, we really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. We hope this has been valuable. We will post this webinar up somewhere for your access later on if you'd like to come back and review the information. Great job, and we really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. So with that, we are going to end the webinar. If you have any more questions, again, reach out to your Beck's seed advisor or your Beck's field agronomist for more assistance. Austin, thank you very much. Everyone, please have a great day.
Thank you very much.